listening on, and their kids. Two of their boys have a condition known as Fragile X syndrome. Jim has a Master's of Divinity right here from NTC in Brisbane, where he also did a research project on the topic that we're looking at today, Theology of Disability. And Jim has taught at a number of secondary school settings for the past 16 years, and this includes Nabarthong State Special School in Brisbane. So he's actually coming home when he comes here to give this talk. So let's welcome Jim tonight.
Thanks, Rob. It does feel like I'm coming home from my other home. It's a large topic, theology of disability, and in a sense we're looking at an understanding of who God is and how that intersects with the area of disability. And the seminar title has changed slightly as I've been preparing over the last couple of months, because even at Christmas time we spend a lot of time with a family, as we often do at Christmas, who have a child with a very significant disability, and a question that often gets asked between the parents mostly is, where is the hope for people who journey with disability? And so while a theology of disability is a very large topic, tonight I'm focusing a little bit more generally on a concept of where is the hope today for people who journey closely with disability. And so it's somewhat autobiographical, I guess, tonight, but also in its attempt to answer that question for my friend and his wife and their family as they journey with a child with a very significant disability. To begin with tonight, though, it is helpful to frame it a little bit with an understanding of the various models which are used to describe disability. And the first model that is often used to describe disability is the medical model of disability. And most often that defines disability as a problem that needs curing. And most often that definition identifies the problem as being located with the individual. And so very often disability is seen in deficit terms. The person is seen in deficit terms. It's a genetic condition located with the individual, or another reason, a disease or a trauma or another health condition. A very negative construct. The charity model is one we would be familiar, the second of the most common models. And the charity model tends to look at people with impairments as those who need help, and others put themselves in the position of being the helpers. And often the money is raised by very well-meaning people, but often by emphasising the helplessness of a disabled person. The final model, the one that I guess most captures me this now, is called the social construction of disability, which actually sees the issue as mainly a creation of society. It doesn't, in the first instance, attribute disability to the individual, but rather to a set of conditions which our culture has created. So, for example, if someone is unable to enter a building, that's because we have not adjusted our attitudes and our practices to create a ramp or to put it in a lift. And so the emphasis of the social construction model is that it's we, in a sense, who must change. It's not that the person with the disability must change in order to fit in with us. It's in fact we who must change in order to make it possible for the person who has the disability to be included. And I'm very taken by that model. But it struck me on the plane up this morning, something that hadn't struck me before, which is that model, which has as part of it disability discrimination legislation of the last 25 years in Western cultures, in a sense says, we're a culture who is not including people with disabilities. Let's make it a law that you have to in a whole range of variety of ways. So we'll adjust our attitudes through legislation, we'll adjust our practices, we'll make it legally enforceable that you must do this, but then we still ask, having changed our attitudes and practices, we still ask people to come to us. And so in a sense it's still a come-to model. And it's a very good model in the sense that it is requiring us to adjust, But it's still requiring people to come to, in a sense, the society we've created. And that can be problematic. It can be problematic. And what I want to do tonight is, it's a sort of an approach which I've never actually hit upon before and in a clarified way. And I want to suggest that we embed this social construction of disability model with Christian ethics, with an understanding of who God is, so that, if you like, we might come up with a Christianised version of the social construction of disability model, that we might be encouraged to adjust our attitudes and practices in a way which doesn't require people to come to us, but encourages us to go to people. And so it is different to the social construction model. And that going to would be characterised by a whole range of understandings of who God is and how he interacted in the form, when he came in the form of Jesus, and who we are as people made in God's image. So that's what I'm trying to achieve tonight. Some kind of understanding that, yes, we would adjust our attitudes and practices, but that would lead us to more of a go-to model rather than a come-to model, even though it needs to still have a come-to aspect. Now we're going to watch. Now, I'll warn you, it's 6 minutes, the video, which is long to show at a seminar, I know, but I think it will help us identify more personally with the circumstances of many people. It's a Louis Theroux video, which I'm hopeful that Aaron will be able to bring up. Yep. And I'm hoping it will help us personalise. To be deeply affected by that. And the concept that we're drawing out again tonight is that for many of us, we live in a parallel world to beautiful Joey and his mum and his dad and his sister. And we, sorry. And sometimes we don't even know that people are living in an overwhelmed situation. And I can almost guarantee, in fact, that within a kilometre, within walking distance of your front door, there will be a family, at least one, who is living in an overwhelming situation. And so tonight is not a theoretical exercise. You know, where is the hope in the present for Joey and his family, beautiful Joey and his family? And often we existing in great comfort in our parallel world, not even realising that someone is existing much differently and is looking for a relationship and can't come and join our world. And yet we're only ever asking them to come. And so that's the challenge. Where is hope? And that's what we're trying. How do we move from parallel worlds to concentric lives? And I'm not a great mathematician, but the term concentric I thought was a great title. And Melinda said, I'll look it up in the dictionary and make sure it is a good title, Jim. And it actually means concentric circles don't appear to touch. But when you look at the definition, they share a common centre. And tonight we're talking about how do we share a common centre, that we might move from parallel worlds to concentric lives, that we might relate to one another. And importantly, not using a charity model, but importantly using a social construction model. So that's our challenge tonight. So in the beginning, then, who is God? What is an understanding of God that we might outline that's for us tonight? Well, my understanding of God begins with the Trinity. And in the Trinity, we have an understanding, from around the 4 to 500s, where people began to really think about the Trinity. And Gregory of Nazianzus was an Eastern theologian, and he said, God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He can be differentiated, but he's nevertheless unified. So he is one God in Trinity, three united in one Godhead. Now, God exists, he said, in an eternally reciprocal relationship, an infinite conjunction of three infinite beings, with mutual relations one to another. Now, around the same time, we may not have heard of Gregory, but around the same time we will have heard of Augustine, who was a Western theologian, and he was the one who identified for us that this eternal relationship is love, that God is love, and wherever there is love, there is always he that loves that which is loved, and then there is love. There is the three. And so for Augustine, each of the three persons of the Godhead dwells in the other and freely bestows love to the other. However, love should not be differentiated from the Godhead. God loves because God is love. And so, as Augustine also said, each as a whole is equal to each as a whole. And so from the combined work of those two men, we can come to an understanding of the core, the centre. And my understanding of who God is based around that. And if we can bring that definition up, possibly, Aaron, to the next slide, I think God is a unified community of differentiated relationships characterised by love, equality, and reciprocity. So there's a starting point for us tonight. Now, in a reverse sort of way, we can test that theory by going to Genesis and seeing how humanity, who's made in the image of God, and test the theory about whether humanity, whether being a person, ideally, in our creation ideal, is an image of that God. And so when we turn to Genesis 1 and 2, we do discover that God creates people to be in a reciprocal relationship with him. God forms the Adam. God breathes air into his nostrils. We see that God speaks to, watches over, makes provision for, interacts on a daily basis with his human creation. Adam cooperates with the Lord. Together they name the animals. The man and the woman are physically present to God. They recognise the sound of him walking in the garden. They evidently speak with him on a regular basis. Humanity in our ideal form was in a reciprocal relationship with God. But we're also created to be in relationship to each other. We see that the Adam can only flourish when God creates a like creature. The Adam was already in a relationship with God, and yet clearly something was missing because God sees that it's not good for him to be alone. And so the creation of a mate becomes the great second act of creation. And together they form the completed human species. That he could have ever remained alone was not and never could be described as very good. The Adam needed Eve to be a complemented and a completed pair as humans. So we're meant to be in relationship with each other. And we're meant to be in a deeply exclusive and intimately loving relationship with each other. Now, there's a Wesleyan linguist, a Hebrew linguist by the name of Joseph Colson, who's done some intense work in this area, and it's very interesting. The verse which we know, which we'll all know, which says, "For this reason a man will abandon or leave his mother and father, and together they will become husband and wife and will become one flesh." He's done some intense work around this verse in terms of the Hebrew behind it. And rather than just translating it as leave, a more accurate translation would be to abandon. And it's to abandon in the sense of becoming unfaithful to all that's gone beforehand. And the two becoming one flesh would be more appropriately translated as cleave. To leave and to cleave. And the culture from which Genesis emerged, in that culture, a man didn't leave his mother and father. And he didn't cleave in the sense that word indicates, which is to cleave, is to become close to the point of being willing to lay down your own life for. To leave and to cleave was countercultural. And yet, in that context, in Genesis, the man was to leave his mother and father. Not to bring his wife as a subordinate into his father's household, beneath his father first of all, and certainly beneath him as her husband. No. To leave, to abandon, to become unfaithful to that cultural setup, and instead to be prepared to lay down his life for his wife, to leave and to cleave. Very intimate, very personal. And then the next part in our definition, one that the equality, the sense in which God in the Trinity is three equal persons, and God's intention for us as people to relate as equals. Now this is important. It's important for disability, because if we don't get the concept that God's intention is the equality of humanity, then we will always, or we're likely to degenerate, I believe, into a charity model, because we don't see people with disabilities as our equal. But God says clearly in Genesis, again, my creation intention is that men and women are created as equals. Now, I've left a photocopied handout at the door if you're interested in chasing the really close linguistic sort of reasons why this is established in Genesis. But the verse which is often translated as, it's not good for man to be alone, I'll make a helper suitable for him, because for Adam no helper was found, which often just has all these connotations of, well, Eve was created second, she's described as a helper. It almost, and then if you have already a hierarchical view of who God is, Father, Son and Spirit, so then when you think God's created people in his image, well, obviously he created Adam, then he created Eve. But all of that can be unpacked, and if we'll leave our patriarchal assumptions aside and then go delve into the Hebrew and its original forms, it's very clear that God created gender equality. And then, and more than that, that people, regardless of gender, ethnicity, regardless of any definition, regardless of people are created as equal. So, when we look at it that way, that God is this, and then people as created in God's image are created to live in a network of relationships where there is love, where there is equality, where there is reciprocity, then it's possible to move forward and think about people with disabilities. Do people with disabilities exist within a network of relationships? Well, ideally, God says, someone with a disability is a person every bit as much as someone without a disability. On the basis, first of all, that I hold them, says God, in a relationship. I saw their yet to be formed body. And God holds people with disabilities in a network of love. And ideally, they already exist in a network of love. In utero. And even at that point are both givers and receivers of love. And so there is reciprocity, there is equality. And we can build our understanding of what it means to be human from there. Ideally. But I wanted to point out two further things before we move on. That God is evidently a going-to God. In the beginning, God creates a space that is different from the perfection of his Trinitarian form, and he goes to and he creates. Following the completion of his creative work, it is evident that God continues to go to people. He meets with them in the garden. He walks with them in the cool of the evening. Even at the fall, God goes to and provides clothing. And right throughout the Old Testament, we understand and we see God going to people. In the Incarnation, if ever we needed an example of a God who is a going to God, it is in the Incarnation. And as mainstream Christians, we believe that at Pentecost, God came to us once more in the Holy Spirit. And we await that day, the second coming, when God will again come to us. And so God is evidently a going-to God. And so we have to sort of pack that away in the back of our mind for the moment. But one other point is that God longs to be our lavish host. That God, all of creation, was intended to provide the kind of existence that we could flourish. The kind of existence, the kind of framework for us to flourish in. Humanity is the goal of God's creation. And he wants to provide for us. And importantly, Importantly, God goes to us. Not, I wouldn't say anyway, not as some would say, in order that he might judge and condemn, but that God comes to us to affirm, to provide opportunity, to be our host, even if we don't desire that. That is the way in which God goes to and comes to us. So moving forward a little in our thinking then, we move forward to the time of Jesus. Now, the culture was anything but God's creation ideal by the time of Jesus, particularly if you had a disability. The Greco-Roman philosophers suggested that human value is primarily social value and is determined by potentiality. They did not designate the status of being a human until after birth. Once they had established that that person would be a contributor to society. Now that's significant. So if you were determined to be someone who did not have that potential, then you weren't a person. And so what happened to you? You could be left on a Roman rubbish dump or taken out onto a hill. You weren't human. Your life was not as valuable because of the fact that you didn't have that designation of being human. Now there's an Australian philosopher, Peter Singer, who is strangely a bioethicist, a world-renowned bioethicist, plants. And yet he has the ear of a lot of our politicians. He often appears on Q&A with Tony, and he's protected on Q&A. There's only certain questions that are allowed to get through to Peter Singer. But he's advocating a return to Greco-Roman understandings of what it means to be human, that it should only be given at some point following birth. Now, the Jewish people of Jesus' day were somewhat different in that they did affirm human value from conception. You know, God saw the unformed body, or the yet to be formed body, or not yet fully formed body. But sort of, I think, unfortunately, they were so bound up in their religious purity laws, so bound by them, that although they had a better understanding of what it means to be human, they very sadly devalued, stigmatized and excluded those who were blind or lame or crippled or with a physical impairment like bleeding. And this occurred on two levels. First of all, the person with an impairment was devalued as being defective, cursed, to use the terms of, some of the writings in Jewish literature. Such defective people were, with just a few exceptions, to be kept from entering the temple area while they remained unclean, which was a lifelong fate if you had a permanent disability. So you were kept away from community because you were ritually unclean. So is it any wonder that we see Jesus, when he encounters people, meeting them on the outskirts of towns? Or when the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years just snuck up in a crowd secretively. She didn't want to be identified. In fact, interestingly, in that account, her name is not provided because she was nameless. She didn't have an identity. Now, in his going, because you see, Jesus was a going kind of guy. In his going, Jesus encounters people who were stigmatized by Greco-Roman and Jewish culture. But Jesus is using some vastly different social construct to that which was being used by his culture. He didn't in any way believe that people with impairments should continue to be treated in that long-established way that had kept them in their social place. Rather, in Jesus' economy, a person's defining character is not their disability, nor is it the social constructions applied to them because of their condition. Rather, Jesus interacts with people knowing that they're valuable. Now importantly, not as if they are valuable, as if he construes them in a way which everyone knew that they were not. Jesus doesn't use the as if description. Jesus treats each person with a disability as worthwhile, as valuable, as a person made in God's image, because he actually knows that they are. Now, if we can, we're just going to see some of the characteristics of Jesus in a series of short sort of sentences with a little bit of short evidence that we really could elaborate on much more fully. But first of all, Jesus brings hope by going to the roads and the marketplaces to meet people where they are at. You will remember this. He meets the Gerasene man, thought not to be in his right mind, near the caves where he lives. He meets the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years in the town square. The woman who had been crippled for 18 years, he meets at her synagogue. The two blind men, they're met by the roadside where they're begging for their existence on the outskirts of town. Now, it's a really significant encounter, that, with the two blind men, because Jesus is... When that interaction occurs, Jesus is actually on the road to Jerusalem in the last week of his life. So that interaction occurs on the Sunday. By the Friday, he would be on the cross. No, he knows that's where he's going. Now, he had a lot on his mind. And yet, as he's walking along the road towards Jerusalem, two blind men shout out, "Jesus!" And there's enough textual evidence to suggest that even his disciples tried to keep those two men quiet. Don't bother the master. And yet Jesus, hearing them, calls out to them and engages with them. And he asks them a very important question. What do you want me to do for you? So Jesus meets people where they're at, on the roads, in the marketplaces, outside the caves, in their locations, the synagogue, their synagogue. And he's prepared to put to one side all that's going on in his life that he might engage with people, that he might have a relationship with people. Now, Jesus embraces these people in countercultural ways. Now, it's hard for us to understand, given that, we're not Jewish and we don't have a synagogue, and we don't understand the sort of principles around that. But when Jesus saw that woman who had been crippled for 18 years in her synagogue, he speaks to her, calls her forward, and puts his hands on her. Now, a man just simply doesn't do that in that culture. Nor do you bring forward someone who is ritually unclean. I mean, she was right at the back of the synagogue. Jesus notices her. She's at the back because, in actual fact, she should probably not even be in there. And yet Jesus calls her forward and embraces her. Countercultural. The embrace Jesus provides is countercultural. He meets people's practical needs. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus said. Jesus doesn't have some sort of preconception around what program these people should be slotted into. He doesn't bring, "This is what you need to do," to them. He actually just says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, I'd be interested if we asked Joey and his family, his mum and his dad and Joey's younger sister. See, most often we say, "Well, I know what Joey and the family need. They need to come to our Saturday night games night." Now, I'm not being cynical there. My friend who lives in Kilcoy, who partly I'm writing this talk for, to answer the question, they're lonely. They had to move to Kilcoy because often what comes with disability is financial hardship. And they had to move to Kilcoy because they couldn't afford to live anymore in Ormiston, where they were living, and the $500 a week they were paying rent. So they move to Kilcoy because they can't afford to live elsewhere. They're lonely. And they encounter a man, a very well-meaning man, who sees their plight and says, listen, why don't you come on Saturday night? It would be good to meet some people. My friend says, we can't come because the sort of the physical environment, it's not possible to keep our son Bobby safe. In fact, if we went, we couldn't even engage with you. Would you come to our place? Now, this same conversation occurred 4 weeks running when they met. Same conversation. Why don't you come to Saturday night games night? Oh, we can't, but I'm trying to explain to you why we can't. Would you come to our place? Now, as at last reports, my friends hadn't been to the games night, and no one, sadly, of the well-meaning people at the church had been to their place. No relationship. You see? No relationship. But Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? And the answers would surprise us. Now, this is something that dawned on me just recently and is a new point, I think, in my thinking. Jesus brings hope by prioritising the greatest need at any given point of a person's social status. Regardless of a person's social status, Jesus prioritises the greatest need. Now, when we look at the stories between that are kind of connected, the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, which is a connected story with the healing of Jairus' daughter. Now, here we have Jairus, who's a male synagogue ruler, who sees Jesus, speaks to him about his dying daughter, and at the same time as that's happening, we have the perpetually unclean woman, who is nameless, who's excluded from the synagogue, who hears about Jesus and dares only to approach him secretively from behind and without addressing him. And she touches his cloak. So ritually, she's just, in Jewish terms, she's contaminated Jesus. So here's a situation where one might expect that a synagogue ruler, male, will be favoured, and whose daughter is dying, will be favoured over a ritually unclean woman who has also slighted Jesus by potentially conveying impurity to him. Surely Jesus will prioritise the influential and the powerful ruler. Surely it's in his interests of the mission to do that. Now, Jesus knows that he will heal Jairus' daughter, and so Jairus and his daughter need not worry. But Jesus, right at that point, says, where is the greatest need? It's the woman who's isolated and excluded and who has spent all her money on sham doctors who didn't fix her. So she's bankrupt, she's lonely, she's isolated from community. And right at that moment, Jesus says, where's the greatest need? And that's where he invests his time. She is prioritised over the wealthy, powerful, influential ruler. And Jesus also brings hope by encouraging people into community and entrusting them with important work. The amazing story of the Gerasene, in some way is talked about as the Gerasene demoniac, or the man from Gerasene who's thought not to be in his right mind. Now, I'm certainly not conflating the ideas of disability with demon possession. I'm not doing that. He was thought not to be in his right mind by the community. And interestingly, Jesus goes to him, is met by him, and following the healing, where everyone was amazed, he says to him, go back to your hometown and tell people what I've done for you. And he goes back and becomes the first missionary to the Gentiles, a man who previously was running around naked, blood spattered, living in a cave. And through an encounter with Jesus, he is then given and entrusted with becoming the first Gentile missionary. Important work for someone who was so stigmatised and marginalised. And finally, in terms of how Jesus interacts, he gently insists that long-held attitudes and practices be adjusted to meet specific needs. When he called that woman forward from the back of that synagogue, do you remember who resisted? It was the religious rulers, the elite, who said, "No, Jesus, it's our practice that you do no work on the Sabbath." And Jesus gently insists that long-held religious practices are adjusted, are put to one side. Why? Because the greater need is the healing. And he was unpopular because of it. So if we move, there's some practices, there's some sort of principles around which Jesus interacted. But if we move forward today you'll see in your handout, if we move forward today to 2018 and we make a few observations about today, this year, where we're at in Western culture, there is no doubt that people with disabilities have benefited greatly, and families who journey with disability have benefited greatly from disability discrimination legislation and things such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme. There is great benefit there. And we are grateful to our culture for those provisions. It's what our culture is legally required to do now, of course. And of course, the law can only compel us so far. Love will compel us further. But we're very grateful because it has helped. You know, one of our sons, for example, has resumed speech therapy because of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We are grateful. Here in Brisbane, you have the All Abilities Parks. They are a wonderful initiative which is starting to sort of sweep across Australia. What a wonderful provision from our culture. We have schools, state schooling systems, that do a wonderful job in special education. Now, we have some representatives from Narberthong. You know, I maintain that Narberthong, since about the late 1980s, has adjusted all of its attitudes and practices to offer a place of welcome to people with disabilities. But they've gone one step further. They haven't just slightly modified the curriculum and asked and made it possible for people with disabilities to come in to the world of curriculum. It's a confusing world to me, and I'm a teacher of 25 years, the curriculum world. They've actually gone one step further. There is a phrase, they adopted a model from Europe, and there is a phrase that is used. We take the classroom to the student. Not we require the student to come to the classroom that we, in our wisdom, have set up. We take the classroom to the student. And so we don't require the student to leave their world and come to our world of curriculum. We say, no, let's adjust everything that we might have a child-centred approach. And at Narberthong, the child, in a sense, leads the process. And gathering, if you like, if you get that image of concentric circles, gathering around the child are physios, speech therapists, OTs, teacher aides, teachers, admin staff, all gathered around, centred on, in Narberthong terms, active learning as the core, so that the child might flourish. We don't require the child to come to us. We go to the child. It's a different approach. Now, there are other great things happening in our culture. The Catholic system in New South Wales is very good in special ed as well. But let's have some observations too about Western church culture. There are some great things happening. Christian Blind Mission worldwide, the Luke 14 initiative in Australia, Elevate initiative in New Zealand, the Mango Tree in Tonga. I've already mentioned the Catholic education system. There's also a school in Sydney called Pacific Hills Christian School, which is for the first time of any Protestant setup I know. The largest growing schooling system in New South Wales is the Anglican Schools Council. As far as I can tell, there is no provision whatsoever, even in the forward thinking or strategic planning, to in any way accommodate students with disabilities. None. Pacific Hills Christian School is the one Protestant Christian school that I know that has made any accommodations. The Catholics are streets ahead. Generally speaking, church sociologists say that churches have not yet adjusted their attitudes and practices. That's simply to bring people in, let alone talking about going to. So we're still working on the bring people in model, but statistically, I think in a recent survey in America said about 65% of churches knew what they had to do in order to adjust their attitudes and practices and their architecture, and less than 5% had done anything about it. So we haven't even we're not yet adjusted that. There's great potential, but we've not yet adjusted it to bring people in, even if they wanted to come in. But we certainly haven't turned our minds around to going and meeting in the marketplace, on the road, the family that lives 1 kilometre down from our front door. And so there's great potential. How then do we interact? Because God wants us to interact. One of the chief means that God's going to draw near is through us, the community. And he wants to draw near to affirm and value and bless and lavish hospitality upon. So, we'll run through quickly some ways. I think the first countercultural way is this. We affirm as Christians the value of a child from conception. I was at Ben's school the other day in Moss Vale, my eldest son with Fragile X. He's sitting on his own, he was fine, he was just comfortable. He saw me across the playground, I walked over to him, sat down, and he said to me, "Dad, I am glad you are here." Put his arm around me, gave me a hug, and I said, "Ben, I am glad you are here. And I'm glad Ben was conceived. I'm glad he was born. I'm glad he lives with us and us with him. And I hope to spend as much time into the future with him as possible." You see, we are, as Christians, we affirm the value from conception. That's countercultural. We want to typify that each of us is created as equal. Now, we don't want a one-up, one-down mentality in our churches. And people with disabilities have reported this, that in the past, someone at the church has said it's a great idea to do a Wednesday night bowling night, whether or not that person in the wheelchair wants to go or not. It's just a great idea. No one's asked whether they want to go. I'm feeding to you what I'm told. Okay? Now, the church gets to be the one up, the host, and the person with a disability gets to be the one down, the guest. But you see, when we understand that there is no us and them, there's God, and then there's us, and us, ideally, in God's creation ideal, are equal, regardless of whatever classification. So we're equal. And when we understand that we're equal, and when we expect reciprocity, when we expect that when we go into a relationship there is giving and receiving, we can't falter into what I think is the charity model. Because we're equals, and we expect to give and receive. We hope, as Christian communities, that we will exemplify the ideal that we are a united community, but we are different. And Adam and Eve were united, yet they were different. God in the Trinity, the three persons of the Trinity are united, and yet they are different. That's our creation ideal for our church. And we're going to be a going community, because God still longs to be with his people. We are going to be a going community. I think we need to be also, if we can move forward there, we're gently insisting that long-held attitudes and practices. Thanks, Aaron. Now, we've got some practices. It's not that we don't believe in working on the Sabbath necessarily, but we've got practices that are long-held in our communities. Now, it may just be that some of those long-held practices are going to need to be put to one side. Now, if someone chooses to come to our church and they have an intellectual impairment, it may be that the minister's sermon needs to be far different to what it is. Far more sensory, pictorial, shorter. And these could all be characteristics that you're hoping that the presenter used tonight. But that may be the case. But it's a long-held practice. That's how we do it. Can we pool our resources? I think the next one there, Aaron, can we... Jesus, what's the next one say? Let's look at that. It is reciprocal. This is from a book. It's on the list I've given you on the back of the handout. This is from a book by Henry Nouwen called Adam, God's Beloved. And Henry Nouwen was a highly intelligent academic, and he left it all at the height of his academic career to go and live with people with severe and multiple impairments. And it was very confronting in the first few months for Henry, he reported. But he said this after a few months: "I still remember those first days. Adam often looked at me. He followed me with his eyes. He did not speak or respond to anything I asked of him. Gradually, very gradually, things started to change. I was slowly getting to know him. We were together, growing in friendship, and I was glad to be there. Adam was no longer a stranger to me, and I no longer a stranger to him. He was becoming a friend and a trustworthy companion. He could not talk with me about the movements of his heart or the heart of God. He could explain nothing to me in words, but his heart was there, totally alive, full of love, that he could both give and receive. It was a reciprocal relationship, and there was respect." And so these are some of the things that will characterise our interactions as church people. We'll go to, we expect reciprocity. It's an egalitarian setup. Can we pool all of our resources just as Jesus pooled his resources to meet a practical need as is expressed to us? Will we adjust our religious practices to take into account people who need the adjustment of those practices? Will we leave our parallel world and instead form relationships centred on our understanding of God that wrap around people? And I'm going to finish with a story that happened at Christmas time at our place. The family, and they've given me permission to use this story. The family from Kilcoy always come to our place, which is generous of them. They're far more adventurous than we are. And they always come to our place at Christmas and they stay for 6 days or 7 days. And right near the end of their stay this year, we had a barbecue on one side of our house. And I hadn't made the correct adjustment. I'm a bit particular about my lawn, and I'd put some soil out now, and to make the lawn perfect. And beautiful Bobby, the kids were playing with the water. Everyone's at the barbecue, all dressed up in our best clothes. It's their last night there, and Bobby loves the sensory input that comes from mud. And we also have a dog, Skipper. Beautiful dog. I sometimes wish we hadn't purchased him. I'm not sure if Melinda's listening. And Skipper is going crazy. And then Bobby, when he gets really excited, his hands are muddy, he wants to give people hugs. Right, now everyone's got their best clothes on. Skipper, his feet are dirty. When he gets excited, he just wants to jump over people. Now Melinda picks up Skipper and takes him inside. And Bobby's mum sees that people are a bit nervous at the barbecue. So we're on one side of the house. They've got all really good clothes on. And she took Bobby around to the other side of the house, the parallel side. And I thought, where is Elisa gone with Bobby? And I went around the other side and she was crying, sitting in the sandpit with Bobby. And she said, "See, Jim, you guys had to take Skipper inside. Well, I had to take Bobby away." And she was crying, and I got Melinda, and they sat there and they cried together. And for me it was this picture of, we do, don't we? On one side of our house there was this barbecue with everyone in good clothes and nice, to something to drink and to eat, and it was all very pleasant, and everyone. And on the other side of the house there was a parallel world. And it struck me that often we live in this way in our culture. We live in parallel worlds. Are we prepared, as my final point tonight, are we prepared to abandon, to leave all that we've held dear, to the point of being unfaithful to what was before, to leave, to abandon all that was before, that we might cleave around people who at this point are our priority. They have priority. Not because they're lesser, not because it's a charity model and it's a condescending thing. Their needs at that point are greater. And people who are living in that different world, as Melinda and I sometimes feel like we are, we want to gather around, yes, Jesus is the centre, God, our understanding of God, but we want to gather around Jesse and Ben as a family. We want to make every adjustment in our attitudes and our practices that will help them to flourish. But in order for us to do that, we need another family who gathers around the centre, but who then gathers around us. And then another family. And it's not that you won't, it's reciprocal. Ben and Jesse have taken Melinda and I to places we would never have gone, metaphorically and literally, if it were not for their presence. I mean, their purpose in life is not to benefit us, but that's what God has done through their presence. And so as people form concentric circles, we find that we all benefit. You know, and especially Joey and his family, Bobby and his family. But it means leaving behind, abandoning some of those attitudes and practices, and cleaving instead, to the point of death. Literally and metaphorically, I think sometimes. Those who are the priority at this point. And it will be reciprocal. Rob.